Felipe Filomeno. I'm acting director of the Center for Social Science Scholarship, which coordinates the Social Sciences Forum lecture series. And this is our first Social Sciences Forum lecture of the semester. It is also the Department of Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies 14th annual Korenman lecture. I want to thank everyone in the department for organizing this lecture, as well as the co-sponsors of this event. We have several: the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Public Health, the Department of Africana Studies, the Department of Political Science, the CAS Dean's Office, the Office of the Provost, the CAS Women's Faculty Network, and the UMBC Social Work Program. Before we begin, I want to mention our next lecture, which will happen at 4 p.m. on Tuesday, April 5th. The Department of Economics will be hosting their annual Mullen Lecture. Dr. Giovanni Perry, professor of economics at the University of California, Davis, will present a talk titled "The Multifaceted Contributions of International Migration to the U.S. Economy in the Last 30 Years." You can find more information on our website, socialscience.umbc.edu. I would also like to invite you to engage with us on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at UMBC Soc Sci. We also recently launched a new podcast called Retrieving the Social Sciences, which you can find on Spotify, Apple, or Amazon. Last but not least, a few housekeeping details. All attendees today will be muted with the video off, but we welcome your comments and questions for the speaker. Just put those in the chat box at any point, and we'll do our best to get to them during the Q&A at the end. Thank you all again for being here today, and now I'll turn things over to Dr. Carol McCann, Chair of the Department of Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much, Dr. Filomeno. Hi, everyone. On behalf of the Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies core faculty, coordinating committee, and affiliate faculty, I'd like to welcome you to the annual Korenman Lecture. This lecture series, is one in which we seek to highlight the wealth of contemporary scholarship, feminist scholarship, and scholarship about gender and sexuality in general that's being produced across the disciplines. The series is named for Dr. Joan S. Korenman, who is the founding director of the Women's Studies program at UMBC. And I want to note that the Women's Studies program was established 40 years ago this spring. To the original minor, we have added a major, another minor, an undergraduate, and a graduate certificate. And we are awaiting the final approval of a new undergraduate certificate in critical sexuality studies. Dr. Filomeno listed the co-sponsors. I want to add our gratitude to them for the support of this program. I also would like to thank Farzana Islam and Amy Barnes for all of their work in setting up the logistics for today's event. Actually, I wanted to ask people for their questions, if they could put them in the Q&A box. It'll be easier for us to track that way. So now, I want to say it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Nicole Mason, President and CEO of the Institute for Women's Policy Research, is one of the foremost intersectional feminist researchers in the nation. She is also one of the few women of color to lead a Washington, D.C. think tank. Now, I have to admit, I'm a bit of a fangirl for the Institute. That's the kind of geek I am, which over the years has produced some of the most authoritative empirical research on matters of women's wage work and economic precarity. For instance, you might know them. The Institute is the go-to source on gender pay inequity and the wage gap. And on the wage gap as it is both on the national and on state levels. Dr. Mason became the Institute president in 2019, and under her leadership, the Institute has become a vibrant, vocal feminist activist, and in particular, an authoritative source on research on pandemic impacts on women's labor force participation, the care crisis, and women's ongoing struggles to create sustainable work-life balances, some of which she'll talk about today. Before coming to the Institute, Dr. Mason was the executive director of the Women of Color Policy Network at New York University's highly esteemed Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. While there, she spearheaded research on issues related to economic security and political participation by women and communities of color. She developed an intersectional approach to social change and policy formation, as well as a complex theory of rights in modern democratic nations, to name just a few of her scholarly works. But as a scholar practitioner, she has a deep commitment to using innovative, rigorous research to inform public policy debates. And so Dr. Mason has also published hundreds of articles that have been featured in venues ranging from Bustle and Essence magazines to the New York Times and CNN. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Nicole Mason to talk with us today about the impacts of COVID on women's work and well-being. Dr. Mason.
So I'm very excited to be here, and I want to thank Carol and Kate and the whole Women Gender Studies Department for having me here. I know I said the name wrong, but I just want to thank you, and it does feel a bit like a homecoming. You know, the Women and Gender Studies program at the University of Maryland College Park was my home, and I learned so much, and so I just feel, you know, very much in debt and overwhelming sense of gratitude for helping to lay the foundation for who I am and where I am today. So I just want to start out by saying that. So I am Nicole Mason. I am the president and CEO of the Institute for Women's Policy Research. For those of you who may not be familiar with our work, IWPR is the nation's preeminent think tank committed to winning economic equity for all women and accelerating women's power and influence in society. My appointment to the position is quite meaningful in terms of thinking about the leadership of women's organizations and think tanks in the US. I'm the organization's second leader, and to some, I was a shocking pick. A shocking pick because women of color and people of color have not traditionally been in the role of thought leader, driving ideas and solutions. I've been in countless decision-making rooms over the years, and I'm either one of or one of few women of color in the room. Women of color, or I'm usually the subject of inquiry, my experience is studied, analyzed, and diagnosed. Policy and decision makers tell us what will be done, the rules we will follow, and the resources we will have. Today, in my role, I am the knower, the interpreter, and the driver of ideas. I have the opportunity to not only interpret my experiences from a place of knowing and understanding of the complexity and nuance, but to lift up and advance the solution and strategies I believe will work and transform communities and lives. The biggest obstacle, though, to transformation and accelerating change are those who use their own experiences or lack thereof to make policies that are harmful, antithetical to building a more just and equitable society, and pass it off as the will of the people or as scientific or rigorous or safe or beneficial to most. We're living in extraordinary times. The decisions we make now about how to engage with others and how we show up with the moral courage to support and protect and provide for those with less power, privilege, and ability will determine our future and whether we will become further disconnected or fully realize our shared humanity. There's an opportunity to build and create new systems. From the economy to the healthcare and childcare systems, we have an opportunity to build a more just and equitable world. In January 2020, we were celebrating an important milestone. For the first time in more than a decade, women made up more than 50% of the US workforce. The booming economy at the time that we were celebrating was made possible in part by women. At the time, I cautioned against a full embrace of celebration. I understood what the numbers masked. Women were struggling to make ends meet or take care of their families. Although women at the time constituted 51% of the workforce, they were also more likely to be in lower wage jobs, have fewer benefits, less job security, and to be economically vulnerable. They also struggled with childcare and other caretaking demands. In other words, all was not what it seemed. A couple of months later, exactly what I understood to be true became our reality. The pandemic hit. In March 2020, the economy shed more than 40 million jobs, and women bore more than 70% of those losses. Nearly 4 in 10 women's jobs have been adversely impacted by the pandemic. In March 2020, the employment rate for women was a historic 14%. For Black and Latino women, the numbers were slightly higher, 16.7% and 18.9% respectively. In 2008, the last major economic downturn, the Great Recession, was defined by job loss in production and manufacturing, impacting mostly men. At the height of the recession then, over 2 years, the unemployment rate never reached above 8%. And during the pandemic, the numbers were more than doubled. Looking at the numbers, I knew we were witnessing a phenomenon different from previous recession, and I wanted to tell people what we were seeing. Privately and in my own writing to our network, I began to refer to it as the she-cession. Then one day when I was being interviewed by the New York Times and they asked what I was seeing and what the data told us, I said, I think we should go ahead and call it the she-cession. And it took hold. The she-cession is now how we come to define the COVID-fueled economic downturn, defined by sharp loss, job and income losses in sectors dominated by women: service, leisure, hospitality, education, and healthcare. In addition to the economic and income losses, schools and daycare closures across the country delivered another blow to working women and families. Not only were women faced with unemployment, but those employed were also charged with providing care for children who were learning virtually. For many women employed in the service or other essential sectors, where you have to show up to a physical location in order to get paid, they faced a tough choice: provide for their families or take care of them. For many, it was an impossible choice. Between August and September 2020, when schools were slated to reopen, more than 865,000 women fell out of the workforce, due in large part to their caretaking responsibilities. It's been a long road and 2 years since we made that milestone announcement about the progress of women in the workforce, and much has changed, and we've learned so much. As we move towards recovery, it will be important to ensure that it is equitable and that those impacted by job and income losses are at the forefront of our minds when we think about job creation efforts or what it takes to truly recover. It'll also help to center those folks when we're thinking about the new systems that must be created to guard against another downturn. Although the unemployment rate has dropped to about 4% for women, it's still higher for Black and Latino women. But GDP is up. That's how we measure economic prosperity in the US. Unemployment down, and the stock market is doing relatively well. So we're already leaning into the narrative publicly that we're on the other side of the pandemic and the economic downturn. But we are not. If we are to measure economic recovery by the ability of our most vulnerable citizens and families to make ends meet, re-enter the workforce, and sustain employment, we're not there yet. These people are likely communities of color, people of color, women of color, are most likely to be left behind. What we saw this with the Great Recession in 2008, when unemployment dropped nationally for everyone, but not for Black and Latino people. The unemployment rate remained at 8%, at just similar to rates at the height of the Great Recession. We turned away from the structural and systemic changes we knew that we needed to ward off another economic downturn. To be sure, the pandemic, the most recent pandemic, exacerbated and deepened many of the existing inequalities and disparities, health, income, racial, and exposed many of our failing systems that were not working for many families in the first place. IWPR recently fielded a survey on the future of work. We surveyed women across the country, and we found that there's a gap between what women say they want, such as things they want, such as paid sick leave, paid family leave, fair compensation, and what they currently receive from employers. And this was the case, especially during the pandemic, when women who were employed in the hardest hit sectors didn't have health care insurance, didn't have the wages to be able to sustain unemployment or to ride out the economic storm. It really made a difference in terms of whether or not they were able to make it to the other side. In our survey, we found that at least 1 in 3 women workers say that they lacked a critical benefit, including paid sick leave, health insurance, or job security. But most of the women that we surveyed believe that those benefits, those things were most important when thinking about their jobs and their economic security. For women reentering the workforce, a living wage and health insurance are the top 2 desired benefits, followed by retirement benefits, job security, paid vacation, paid sick, and family leave. What this all points to when we think about what women are saying and what we're hearing and actually what is being echoed across the country is that there is a real deep need for a gender equitable recovery. A gender equitable recovery works to ensure that those most impacted will be at the center of our recovery efforts, and that the policies and programs we are seeking are meant to fix the systems and structures that weren't working for women, families, or workers. When I was thinking about what we needed, I immediately began to think about how we might overhaul, reimagine, or build from the ground up an economy that would work for all of us, rather than just the few at the top. I wanted to explain what we needed and why we needed it. So I want to talk a little bit about what I do think we need. The first thing that I think we need is a robust care infrastructure. The pandemic revealed that we had we had no care infrastructure, and the one that we had wasn't working for families. Families were living in childcare deserts, and we also lacked high quality, reliable, and affordable care, where no family spends more than 7% of their income on care. Now families can spend up to 30% of their income on care, and some families spend more. If we have a system where no family spends more than 7% of their income on care, what that means is that frees up money and resources so that they can pay for other necessities like housing, food, and other basic necessities. If the United States spends less than 1% of its GDP on childcare, only above Turkey and Ireland. So the floor is really low, and we can do so much more. And when we think about the economic benefits of a robust childcare infrastructure, if U.S. women had the labor force participation of Sweden, a country where there is subsidized care, it would contribute more than $1 trillion to our GDP. The next thing that we need is paid sick and family leave. What we learned during the pandemic is that paid sick and family leave is not a nice to have or should be dependent upon an employer, but a necessity, especially during a pandemic. When we surveyed women across the country, paid sick leave was top of their list. The other thing that we need is a robust social safety net. Right now in the US, less than 3% of families receive cash assistance. And what we saw during the pandemic was the lack of safety net meant that we spent trillions of dollars to make sure that many families didn't fall deeper into poverty, or they were able to stay afloat during job loss and income loss. We need altogether a bundle of policies that will work to ensure that my race, your race, ethnicity, occupation, class, or gender identity, or citizenship status does not determine whether or not you will have your basic needs met in one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Next, when it comes to work, the pandemic has forced us all in our private and professional lives to rethink what it means. For women, it brought to life the many conversations that we were having in private about work-life balance and childcare. It brought those conversations public. For the first time, women in the C-suite and women working in grocery stores understood that being unable to do it all was less about our will and capacity to find more time in a day or to be better organized, but we were working in a system that was failing us and that it wasn't our fault. The other thing that we learned is that work could happen from anywhere and at any time. For so long, asking for workplace flexibility seemed like an accommodation and was off the table at many companies or organizations if you wanted to advance in your career. During the pandemic, flexibility became a necessity. And then we started to organize our lives around, we began to organize our work around our lives instead of the other way around. Now, again, here we have the opportunity to reimagine work, to reimagine workplaces and policies and practices that work for the majority of the population, again, and not just the few. And when it comes to thinking about work, we all want three basic things. The first thing that we want when we're thinking about work and when women are thinking about work is a good job. A good job is one that makes good use of our skills and our talent, one that has benefits like paid and sick leave, flexibility, and where we all feel valued as both a worker and as an individual. And as we think about women reentering the workforce, it's really important to make sure that we are not only thinking about women entering non-traditional jobs like manufacturing, production, and construction, but thinking about making the sectors where women are already in, like healthcare, education, leisure, hospitality, making those jobs good jobs, one that pays well and enables women to be able to take care of their family and are economically secure. The second thing that we all want is to be compensated competitively and equitably for the role we are in and for the skills we bring to the table. Right now, women and some workers are not compensated fairly or equitably. Women earn, we've all heard this, 84 cents for every dollar a man earns. For Black women and Black and Latino women, the gap is even wider. The pay gap, the difference between what men and women earn for comparable work, is not estimated to close until 2056. And for Black women, it will not close for 100 years, and for Latino women, for more than 225 years. What that means is that my daughter's daughter, if we do nothing to close the gap, my daughter or my daughter's daughter will not see pay equity in their lifetimes. Women lose more than $1 million to the pay gap over their careers. Materially, what this means is that it will take women longer to reach critical milestones like home ownership. It's less money to save for college for their children, pay down debt, or start a business. For some women, it's not having to choose between putting food on the table and paying rent. We all want to be compensated fairly and equitably. The last thing I believe we all want when it comes to work is to be treated with dignity and respect, to be able to work without fear or harm, discrimination, or harassment. In addition to being valued for our skills and contributions, we want to be valued for who we are. Women and people of color face a tremendous and disproportionate amount of discrimination in the workforce. From 1997 to 2018, there were close to 2 million discrimination complaints filed with the EEOC. In 2017, 34% centered around racial and over 30% on sex or gender. It is estimated that nearly 40% of women experience sexual harassment in the workplace, and 3 in 4 sexual harassment claims in the workplace go unreported. And of those who do make claims, 50% are retaliated against by their employers or colleagues. Women of people of color say that working from home over the pandemic over the last 2 years has been a welcome relief. They don't have to deal with microaggressions or other harmful practices that may impair their ability to perform. It shouldn't have to be this way. In this moment, we have the opportunity, as I said, to imagine work for the first time in more than half a century. The first thing we must do is to examine our workplace policies, models, and practices. We can ask, how does our workplace model help and support working mothers and families? How might our workplace and policies and practices harm them? We can ask, do women of color feel safe, valued, recognized, or seen in our workplace? Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. About 20 years ago now, there were maybe dozens of articles written about millennials entering the workplace and what they would need to be successful and how companies might adapt. The articles asked, what do millennials want? How do we attract them? How do we retain them? And the answers were varied. Millennials like flexibility, they liked work-life balance, they needed inspiration and meaning in their work, and they wanted to feel included and appreciated. So all of this work and research went into understanding the millennial experience in the workplace. They also wanted to blow off steam and recharge in real time, so ping pong tables and other amenities popped up as a part of workplaces. Whole campuses were built around these new workers. Whole campuses were built around what these new workers not only needed, but wanted to be successful. Guess what? We've never done the same thing for women. Despite women being more than 50% of the workforce, our workplace model has never caught up to this reality. We still operate with a Mad Men 1950s workplace model where men are the primary wage earners in their families and women stay home. Long hours in the office are expected, and there's very little consideration for the caretaking responsibilities of women, which, by the way, is very significant compared to men and to their male counterparts. And we saw this during the pandemic. Today, also, many women are breadwinner mothers, meaning they contribute 40% or more of their income to their households. In families with children, 90% of parents work outside of the home, and 15 million families in the US with children under the age of 18 have a breadwinner mother. Long gone are the days where women's income accounted for a minor share of household income and workforce participation was optional. As a result of our very male-centered workplace model, women workers lose out. They lose out in terms of their career investment and earnings. They are the first to off-ramp to work to take care of children or to care for an aging or ill parent. When they are not able to work or stay late or around the clock, they're often penalized. We need to replace our antiquated workplace models to reflect our modern reality. The pandemic has provided us a great opportunity to do so. We now know flexibility works and does not reduce productivity. We kind of already knew this. We know that allowing workers to have more say in how, when, and where they work matters, not just in terms of retention, but job satisfaction. Example I would offer is in our organization, the Institute at IWPR. Our research center is majority women, but our workplace model is still very much traditional. While we provided some flexibility, it was more or less what other companies or organizations offer to their employees. During the pandemic and with schools closed, we needed to adapt. And in addition to being 100% remote and moving to deadlines to accommodate our new circumstances, we looked for what else we could be doing differently or better. We had a flexible spending account for childcare for employees, but we wanted to do more. We created a new policy where we reimburse up to $4,000 in care expenses annually for employees, and we made it permanent. It made a big difference for our staff and signaled that we cared about who they were outside of work and understood the role and expense childcare plays in their lives. How might this policy of providing a care subsidy chip away at a workplace model or workplace inequality for women? Let me tell you how. So I've been doing this work and organizing for a very long time. And before the pandemic, I traveled a lot for work, but most of that work, most of the time, I paid for care outside of my pocket. And I had 12 at the time newborn twins. And so every time I had to travel for work, it was money I had to pay out of my pocket, thereby reducing my overall compensation. I was essentially paying for work. It was an invisible tax. The child care subsidy changed that. The cost of my care was now covered. It's a small gesture from a relatively small organization that made a really big difference for me. And I knew because of my experience what a burden that was, and allowed me to be able to afford care, but also extend that to other women. As women who have left the workforce begin to reenter, it will be important to examine workplace policies and practices to support reentering and also help women to sustain employment. And to be honest, in the absence of federal and state level policies, which are a stalemate right now, employers play a huge role in terms of how and when women will reenter the workforce. Flexibility, paid and sick leave and all those other benefits will make the difference. The next thing I want to talk about is how we might accelerate the closing of the pay gap. So again, the pay gap has only closed about 10 cents in about 16 years. One of the things that would really go a long way is to democratize pay. Sorry. Sorry. Sorry, I'm so sorry. I'm trying to. Sorry, very sorry about this. So to accelerate the closing of the pay gap, we should democratize compensation. By democratize, I mean make it fair, equal, transparent, and clear. In many organizations and businesses, pay and compensation are all over the map and opaque. We tell women to negotiate. Before we were in a student session, we were talking about women negotiating salaries. Studies show that when women compared to men, studies show that women compared to men are less likely to negotiate their salary, and when they do, it can backfire, meaning they're not viewed favorably by their employer, and they often get less. The same is true for people of color. Pay and compensation should not be based on what an employee can negotiate, but their experience and the talent and skills they bring to the table. It should be equal pay for equal work. In theory, we all know this, but in practice, this is not what happens. There's too much leeway and allowance for human bias to influence the process. It has a disproportionate impact on women, gender nonconforming people, and people of color. So what should we do? And what can we do? We can create compensation schemes or plans and organizations and companies that reflect our values and that are clear and transparent. By compensation plan, I mean designing a plan where everyone receives the same pay and benefits for the same or comparable roles within an organization. When we frame pay and compensation in this way, it makes it seem as though pay equity is an individual problem rather than a systemic problem, and whereby women of color come out on the losing end. So failing to negotiate or being able to negotiate or having a compensation scheme allows us to be able to make sure that we can pay everyone fairly, but also make strides towards closing and accelerating the closing of the pay gap. The last topic I want to talk about is the Great Resignation. And according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, 4 million Americans quit their jobs in 2021. I was at an event earlier this week, and a C-suite executive was doling out advice to the audience, and she said, "Now is the time to ask for a raise, to make your move." She said, "There's a war on talent, war for talent, and employees have an advantage." People, mostly women, in the room perked up, and there was a feeling of empowerment in the air. However, I didn't really feel that way. When I got into the car, I began to reflect upon her remarks, and I realized that for women in the room, the narrative of leveraging their skills and talents in a competitive marketplace was considered a good thing. However, when I thought about the lower wage workers, those who had been most impacted by the income and job losses during the pandemic, I knew that there was a different narrative. When we look on TV and we listen to the national narrative, lower wage workers who are standing up and saying it's not okay to not have health insurance, flexibility, or job insecurity, they've been called greedy, unreasonable, and lazy. And when we are thinking about a gender equitable recovery, it's really important that we have an intersectional analysis about how we think about how women have been impacted differently based on their race, gender, ethnicity, and social location and other markers of difference. We must work to point out the contradictions in the scapegoating and to do our part to ensure that there is an equitable recovery for all. I want to end where I started, the pandemic and its effects. The pandemic has accelerated and made conversations around work that were not possible 2 years ago possible. As far as I can see, there are only two paths forward. The first path is rooted in fear and scarcity, going back to the way things were and using the economic downturn as an excuse to regress, not make the changes that we know, the systemic and institutional changes that we know would make a difference for women. The second is one that I believe is where we all should be headed, one where progress, expansion, and a reimagining of systems, institutions, and an economy that works for everyone. I think that it's possible, even though we've had some progress has stalled, I still feel that we are on our way. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mason, for your incredible, thoughtful, and comprehensive comments on labor and women of color and equity. I'm just going to moderate the Q&A for you. So our first question is from Darcy Adams. And Darcy asks, how do you suggest individuals go about requesting accommodations like flexible work or work from home with the country trying to shift back to in-person work, aside from just refusing jobs that require it?
So that's a really good question, Darcy, and actually one that I deal with almost every interview at this point. And the good news is that before the pandemic, we weren't talking about many, workplace flexibility. When women asked for workplace flexibility, it was considered a special consideration or accommodation. Now that's not the case. We know that flexibility works. And so flexibility actually is one, a negotiation point, but also the new currency. And so companies and organizations, in order to attract top talent, have to really take into consideration remote work, but also hybrid schedules. I don't think we have figured it out yet. So, we have companies and organizations like ours. We are hybrid schedules. So now we're in the office 3 days and 3 days a week and 2 out of the office. And so what has been really very important in this moment, which I think is a win for women and for women in the workplace, is that there's more conversation about workplace flexibility, and it's not something that can derail a career, because before, if you asked for it, it could derail your career advancement and mobility. You weren't seen as serious, and you were left out of conversations. And so that's no longer the case. It may still be the case in some pockets, but it's really changed and help to shift the conversation.
So partially, in a way, the pandemic gives permission to have a conversation that would have otherwise been taboo. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I just don't think that, I mean, we did have a very traditional, and I think it's a male-centered model of work, that the hardest worker worked 9 to 5, sometimes 9 to 7. You had to show FaceTime to your employee, so you needed to be in an office. All of these old ways of sort of advancing in a career. And what we learned, and I think technology helped that, we're having a whole conference, a whole lecture series on, virtually, it changed the terms. So, so now employers, myself included, have to make the case about why you need to be in the office when we can get on Zoom, or why, some people had hour commutes. I mean, from a childcare perspective, my children are a little bit older now, but I remember, rushing from work across town, almost getting in an accident because, I didn't want to be late because they charge $1 a minute or something, as a penalty for being late. And so, and that sort of anxiety that many mothers face, a lot of us in silence, like we really did some negotiating, like, now that's a public conversation. And now we can say, you know what, and I've actually had 2 new employees negotiate, they're like, I like being able to pick my children up from school. So, this is the schedule I need. And so that's pretty amazing, actually. And so I don't think we can unring that bell.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question, for that response. I just want to note for folks who are popping into the Q&A box, the attendees' mics are turned off, so you do have to submit your question in writing either through the Q&A box or through the chat box, and then I'm happy to read it out loud for you. Our next question comes from Emily Pacera. Emily asks, I see majority women leaders in service learning partnerships and across campus at UMBC. How do you see applied learning experiences, service, internships, research, etc. in college during/post the pandemic, supporting job participation and closing the pay gap?
So internships, how do internships, like learning experiences, impact people going into the workforce?
Sorry, I was muted. How do applied learning experiences like internships and service, etc. in college support job participation and closing the pay gap?
Well, so I really think, so I'm a big fan of internships and, learning experiences while in college, because I do think that they prepare you for whatever you're going to do next. I think, and it's not the case now as much, but we've sort of moved away from unpaid learning experiences so that more people can participate, and we understand that, people of color or people who need to earn or support themselves while they're in college, they need to be paid for internships. So we've done some work around the equity piece. In terms, I just want to make sure I'm understanding, in terms of thinking about how the internships apply to workforce development and closing the pay gap, I'm not really sure I can draw a dotted line, because I know the way we think about internships at IWPR is that, it's a part of your college experience. We look at it when we're thinking about hiring and how your breadth of experience. To me, when I think about accelerating the closing of the pay gap, I actually am with Megan Rapinoe on this, and she says, you can't outperform inequity or the pay gap. Like, these are structural and systemic issues, and you can't negotiate, out of inequality. So I do think applied learning experiences are really very important, and we look and value those when we are reviewing resumes. But in terms of closing the pay gap, I think there's some systemic and structural and institutional changes that we need to make.
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense.
That was a long way. I had to get my head around that question.
Take your time. We have plenty of time, folks. So also feel free to continue adding questions. The next question is from Carol McCann, and Carol asks, what would a robust social system look like, and what would it include?
Oh my goodness, it would include everything. So I tell this. I was talking to funder once, and she said, you know, we can't keep, it was around, she was funding abortion access. And this is related to the social safety net question. So she was supporting abortion access, so providing money to organizations to support women who needed emergency care, right? And so she said, well, you know what we really need is universal health care that covers abortion services. That's what we really need. But I know we're not going to get that. But I know we also can't sustain this model of, and I said, well, why don't we just ask for what we know that we need? If we need universal health care that covers abortion services, let's ask for that. We know that we need universal child care as a part of a social safety net system. Let's do that. You know, many of our programs to access, you know, cash assistance, you know, food assistance is predicated on, it's means tested. So in order to access services, you have to be below a certain income. But we saw in the pandemic, you could go from having an income to no income at all. Or, you know, if you own a home, you know, you're barred from, you know, being able to access benefits. So if I were building a social safety net, it wouldn't be means tested. You would be able to tap in, anybody would be able to tap in, which, by the way, is not crazy making. It happens in other countries. So you would be able to tap in when you needed support, when you lost a sudden, you know, you had a sudden drop in income. I do love basic income. So again, I think we are a wealthy country. We, you know, there's no reason for anyone to not have their basic needs met. And you shouldn't have to be, you know, have no assets and wipe everything out in order to be able to access support or help. And, you know, a lot of people, when we're talking about these sort of policies like healthcare for all, or, you know, a robust social safety net where nobody goes without, or, you know, tax policies like that include the child care tax credit, that pulls, you know, millions of children out of poverty. You know, there's a lot of name calling, or this is socialism, or this is it. And it's really not. In fact, the US is one of a few developed countries that do not have these things. And so my question is just why not? And so my thing is thinking about how we build the public will for these kinds of policies and start where we want to be. If we want universal health care that covers abortion access, we want universal child care. If we want, you know, whatever we want, we should start there as opposed to what we think is safe or what is, you know, might be palatable to whom. You know, it's not like someone's going to say, well, you know, we'll just give you a little bit of health care, you know, which is what we have now. We have a little bit of health care. So that's, it's all those things.
Right. Thank you. Our next question is from Katie Kine. Katie says, first, thank you so much, Dr. Mason, for sharing all of us with this today. My question is about both the substance and also the messaging of the need for flexibility. I'm wondering what we do with the fact that this thing so needed by women in the workforce, flexibility to shape schedules around things like childcare demands, is also the language deployed by the gig economy and other neoliberal aspects of the economy that come with worse working conditions, lower benefits, lower wages, etc.
So again, I think, so again, I'm very big on shaping the story and the narrative and really heading off the dangerous, like, I'll give you an example. So you have all these companies, really big corporations who say, no, you don't have to, you know, you don't ever have to come back to work. You never have to come back to the office. And people are like, wow, that's great. Google, look at them. They're doing that. Then you get behind closed doors and what you realize is they're saying, okay, you can work from Iowa, but we're going to lower your pay. We're gonna, you know, pay you the market rate in Iowa, even though you're doing the same work that you were doing in New York. And we're not having that we're not having that conversation. We're not having the conversation about what that means for pay equity. We're not having, you know, and so how do we broaden the conversation so that we don't get trapped into like, oh, well, you want flexibility, you can have it. But what that means for you is that you're not going to have benefits or you're going to have to make lower pay. And so what I think the argument that we are making or how we are framing it is that, you know, flexibility is not an accommodation. We know that when we think about women's labor force participation, we know that that makes a difference. And we've always known that that makes a difference for women's career mobility. The idea that, for example, that women were voluntarily off-ramping to have children is actually not true. It's a constrained choice, but it's a choice because we have a workplace model that is not flexible and that, you know, is able to accommodate working mothers. So I do think that the struggle that we have now is creating a narrative that is, you know, that we allow to breathe and be able to tell the real story and not get into, well, if you want this, we're going to take away that. And what we're saying is that no, a quality job is a job that has flexibility, that has benefits, that, you know, has fair and equitable pay, where I'm treated with fair, dignity. So we're, you know, how do we broaden the narrative and framework and how we talk about and think about this?
How to refuse some of those compromises that are being suggested.
Yeah, but it's really very, I mean, because there's nobody ever talks about that. Nobody, when you hear the story about Google saying everybody can work remotely, for example, you don't hear about what else they're doing. Like they're also cutting pay, or they are also, doing some other things that may be counter to what we believe is happening around flexibility and remote work.
Okay, thank you. So our next question is from Andrea Kalfoglu, who asks, women are disadvantaged within families because of caregiving expectations. With merit-based raises and promotions, women may not progress as quickly. Should this be something employers recognize and respond to?
Merit-based promotions and
Read it again. So Andrea is writing that women are disadvantaged within families because of the caregiving expectations that are placed upon them. And so with merit-based raises and promotions, women may not progress as quickly, presumably because of the caregiving expectations. So should this be something that employers recognize and respond to?
yes, absolutely. And by merit-based promotion or like having caretaking demands limit women's career mobility. And that's something that employers should take into consideration. Well, that's always been we've been, again, we've been saying that for a long time that women bear majority of caretaking responsibility, has a, in some instances, a disproportionate impact on their career mobility, earnings, income, motherhood penalty. And for me, there's just, even during this pandemic, which I did think, I think we all thought that, of course, out of this pandemic, we're going to get all these sweeping structural changes. The workplace is going to be transformed and all of these things. And it hasn't happened. And it doesn't even, I'm not even convinced that we will get to a place where those things happen. So when I think about what can be done, just like I said, like individual employers or organizations where you're employed, really examining those workplace policies and things that are embedded systemically into promotion and, career advancement and sort of, challenging those things. But I think that it's a systemic and structural problem, and actually some of the things like the Paycheck Fairness Act at the federal level and some of the other things around workplace flexibility, limiting, people are doing some really interesting things in other countries around 4-day work weeks, flexibility, not, limiting work hours, things that we're so far away from. It seems like another, like crazy town when you propose those things, but might be key to sort of blunting some of the effects of, what's been, women's experience in the workplace.
I wonder if some of the tension in that question is around the idea of merit-based, because we know that merit is unequally recognized for folks of color and non-binary folks and women. And so any merit-based has to be also checked for implicit bias or checked for other kinds of.
You know, I work in the nonprofit sector. We don't really do merit-based bonuses, but in other like corporations, there are merit-based bonuses, and it is performance-based. Um, and um, and again, that is, you know, baked into that is a lot of assumptions about your availability, um, you know, subjectivity in terms of thinking about performance. And so even when I think about this, and I was talking about the compensation scheme and plan, like the only way we can sort of blunt those kinds of things, or, you know, the biases and the implicit bias and the, you know, that comes in into play, is by not doing it, by having a compensation scheme that says if you know, based on your experience, number of years experience, I'm not talking about, you know, a subjective experience, that's how you base compensation. And it's clear, it's everybody can see it, it's transparent. Those are the kind of systems, and you know, we have that system at IWPR. So for example, if you were going to apply for a job at IWPR and you wanted to know how much you were going to make, and you were fearful that you're going to have to negotiate something, you just go to the website, you click on our compensation scheme, and you will know how much you will be paid for the role. And that's amazing. So, and if businesses did that and were transparent, and, you know, I think we'd be at a different place in terms of our, you know, thinking about the gender pay gap.
Absolutely. Okay, so we have a couple more questions. This one is from Divya Bhatt. Divya asks, as a woman of color, how do you deal with discrimination from white women, especially in majority women settings?
Oh my God. This is somebody reading? No, somebody in my life right now. Um, so I was saying before in our conversation, our smaller group conversation with students, I think you know, I've been doing this work since I was maybe 19. You know, I started off doing campus organizing, and I consider myself a part of the women's movement, whatever that means. And my biggest heartbreak in this work has not come from, you know, Mitch McConnell or what's this, Joe Manchin, or any of these other people who we understand as not in alignment with my values and where I want to be. It has actually come from the women who I've considered to be my comrades and sisters in the work. Many of them have been white women. And, you know, that's really been painful to try to reconcile. And actually, there's not a lot of conversation about it. There's not a lot of space for it. But I have to say that I talk to many leaders, you know, women of color leaders, and we all have the same sort of stories. And it's just really been painful. And then when you see, for example, like, you know, like 2016 or 2016 with white women and Trump. And then you see white women in Virginia with Youngkin. And, you know, I think it complicates what we understand about how we think about solidarity, and, you know, allyship. But it's that, I think that is been the most painful in my work over the last, you know, 20 something years.
I think the question sort of prompts that pain, right? Like it prompts that violence.
I mean, I just wish we were just more open, and like we use a lot of coded language. I mean, I mean, I think I came into the work very idealistic, and I assumed that we were all on the same page. We actually all had the same language. We were all working towards the same thing. And I mean, some of it is super shocking, and I say heartbreaking because it is very heartbreaking. It's not, it's just heartbreaking.
Thank you. We have a few more questions. Our next one is from Katie Kine again. The question is, the huge number of women leaving the workforce in the pandemic has clearly resulted in huge staffing shortages in positions traditionally held overwhelmingly by women, childcare, education, nursing, etc. And it's drawing attention to the ways that women's underpaid labor was holding up so many other aspects of the economy. Do you predict a larger shift in what we value and how some of this traditionally women's work is paid as we see the effects of the lack of childcare, for example?
No. It's crazy. It's not. It's just, you would think. That's what I was saying that, like, I was so, a year ago, I was like, oh my God, we're gonna get everything. People know that, childcare is essential. People know that women are the ones propping up this economy. It came to a halt as soon as women left, and of course, people know what it means to have women in the economy. And so I was just, I felt like it was like our day or something. And it's just sort of like, oh, okay, well, and again, I wanted to end with that story about the lower wage workers, and like sort of like there's this moment where people are like renegotiating work and saying, oh my God, you can go in there and ask for whatever you want and you're going to get it. You're going to get a 30% rate. Like I hear these stories like raises and stuff. And then I was like, but that's not what's happening for lower wage workers or people in education and healthcare services. In fact, when people are leaving, if you interview businesses or you watch TV, they'll say they just don't want to work. They're just lazy, and but there's no talk about, like, yeah, nobody wants to come back and work for like $7 an hour, no health insurance, bad working conditions, all of these things. And but I think that it's race and classed and gendered. um and so I just want to have that conversation about like complicate it a little bit more. But the short answer is no. I want it to be. I want raises. I want, and they have because I get into these fights with the economists all the time about like wages have gone up, like a dollar or something like that. But one, if the rate at the rate of inflation, if we would have raised, what is it? The minimum wage based on inflation would be like $24 right now an hour. So like we're at 7. So going to like $8 or $9 is actually not sustainable. It's not a living wage.
When you responded to that question so firmly, a ripple of like, oh, dang, went through the chat and the webinar. All right, our next question is from Darcy Adams. Darcy asks, how do you expect the long-term effects of the pandemic, COVID long haulers in particular, to change the outcomes of your research and recommendations, especially in a country not equipped to handle disability?
Ooh, that's a really good question. Again, unfortunately, so I'll answer it 2 ways. So there are some states that are moving to, for long-term COVID, people are experiencing long COVID, to, give them protections, disability status, or, accommodations. But for other workers, in other states, that is just not the case. And so what I see, which is what I see for, actually a large swath of workers, long haulers included, is that they will be left behind. And that's what happened in 2008. Like, the economy was doing good, the conversation shifted, and then we just moved on. And so in 2008, it was like rural communities and economies that got left behind, Black women and families in rural communities. And this time it will be people who, are their health isn't maybe impacted by COVID, or they still are, unable to re-enter the workforce because of caretaking demands, not only for their children, but their aging parents. But it doesn't have to be this way. I think so many of us are, again, thinking about like, how do we come back, step back, and then come back in and really think about how do we start over again. So even when we were thinking about, we lost the Build Back Better Act, so we just should go ahead and admit that it's gone, even though some people are not there yet. But what we've been talking about now is like, how do we take it apart and try to advance individual pieces of that? And so like, what is our new strategy? So it's about re-strategizing and thinking about like, what do we need in this moment, and what ways can we go about trying to get it at the state or federal level?
Thank you so much. Our next question is from Jordan Packett. Jordan writes, "Thank you, Dr. Mason, so much for this lecture. It's really timely. My question's about other aspects of need workers have been forced to confront and to discern how to ask for or even create support for in their workplaces. Thinking about things like bereavement leave, I'm still hearing stories about constraints on who we are allowed to grieve according to our workplace's policies and bosses say so, despite the collective knowledge of over 1 million deaths to the virus in our nation alone. Knowing that death and premature death is simultaneously being structured by the violence of our societal systems and structures, thinking, for example, about medical racism and disproportionate losses to the pandemic within Black communities. In what ways do policies need to shift to support those whose families are experiencing death and loss in ways that perhaps those in their workplaces can't conceive of?" And wondering about this, given that many of the asks named today may be centered around new life, for example, maternity or paternity leave or childcare, rather than centered around loss of life.
Let me tell you, that is like the best academic question ever to be. It's just like, it's
Jordan
long,
is
it's
exceptional.
meaty, it's like, it has a lot of turns in there. But I think that, so the short answer, I mean, I was going to say unions, right? And so I know in the nonprofit sector, even in the women's organizations, they've unionized. And so for protections and benefits, and we know that when women belong to unions, they earn more and they have more flexibility and they're treated better. And thinking about, it's just the way what the pandemic has done for me is sort of reveal the way that workers have been treated and that have been allowed to be treated, from policies like bereavement leave and not being able to take leave to mourn, or when you feel traumatized, whether it's by death or by racial trauma, to no paid sick or family leave, horrible stories about people fearing for their job or going to work with COVID because they don't want to lose their job. We've known this all along, like people who work in a relationship with lower wage workers know this experience, but right now we have a more collective consciousness around just how bad it was and is. And what I'm hoping is that it sparks the tiny or big, I'm saying tiny because I don't want to seem too radical, but revolution in terms of how we think about work and recenter, who's important in this whole thing. It's workers. And so I'm hoping that we can start to, talk, organize around, my union friends say, worker power, but it's just, workers in this moment, well, before pre-pandemic, had very little power in their workplace. And so, bereavement policy, or, it's just the suspiciousness of workers. Like, what are you doing? What are you taking off? Are you really mourning? I mean, how do you tell if you're mourning? It's just, so I'm just hoping that we just tip the scales a bit, to a more humane, workplace that considers the whole person. And I think that's what people are asking for now. They're like, I have a life. I have a family. I have kids, actually. And women, and I'll just say this last thing is that, like, even during the presidential election cycle, the Democratic presidential election cycle, most of those women were mothers on the stage, and you never heard one of them talk about being a mother or having to, like, juggle being a politician, or like what that means, because a lot of that was invisible, and it was purposeful. And to treat people like workers or disembodied workers, and not, and that's true for all of us, our labor. See, I know this is going down slippery slope. Next thing I'm Marx. But I'm just saying that I'm just hoping that the scales tip back the other way.
Absolutely. We still have a little bit of time. I don't see any other questions from the audience, but I wondered if I might pose one since we have a minute. And one of the things that happens in professions where passion is part of the description of the job. So for example, teaching, like you have a passion and a calling for it, or social workers, it's a passion and a calling that they have for their communities. Those folks tend to be lower paid and also experience much higher rates of burnout because of the sheer amount of labor that they are doing, especially folks who work with disadvantaged communities or minority communities. So I'm wondering, how do you begin to have a conversation about pay equity in those professions that have a narrative about passion driving your labor as opposed to compensation driving your labor?
Well, I mean, again, I'm for, listen, so we know that, social work, nonprofit sector, teaching, education, healthcare sectors are all dominated by women. And by the way, there's not one sector that's dominated by women that pays more than what men earn in male-dominated sectors. In fact, when men earn in sectors dominated by women, they earn more than women in those sectors. So, that's an issue anyway. So, but I think that when words like passion or commitment, especially in the nonprofit sector, get used to sort of justify, not compensating people or exploiting people's labor, then that's a problem. And this is labor segmentation. This is structural. And again, and I don't know what to do. I mean, I can't say I know what to do about it, because, like, I'll take the childcare sector. I sit on this board, and the salaries for it's a family care. They provide, it's a network of family care providers, so they get paid really low. They're care workers, and the organization is doing really well. Right? It's doing really well. They got money from Mackenzie Bezos, so or Mackenzie Scott. So, and I say, then they were talking about pay and paying the family care providers, and they said, well, we already gave them raises, but it's not a lot, but it's still a little bit above market. I said, the market is horrible. They were severely underpaid. I said, so I don't, yes, you can get a fancy strategic plan, but raising the wages of the family care workers is probably a better thing to do, even if they're in line with market rate, which is not high. And so, but that never occurred to them to raise the wages. And that's a very progressive organization. And that's what happens across all of these sectors, right? They're like, well, we're paying market rate. And so when you pay a little bit above market rate, you think you're doing well, but the market rate is repressed. So it's, and so it's just, so anyway, but I just say, if I were going to give any young person some advice about compensation is pay, and pay is, I don't know. I'm going to say ask for what you're worth, but that just sounds like a cliche. But I think we just need to transform, these systems, and not systems, but I don't know. I don't know. I would say ask for more money, but if they're not going to give it to you because they say they don't have it, or they expect you to be passionate and committed, I don't know. I don't know. I don't have an answer.
Well, you've
Uh,
already given us quite a few big
so I don't
answers
know.
and many things to think about.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's a conversation to change, to echo a point you said earlier, that it has to be a broader narrative.
a broader narrative. But I mean, listen, I've been in nonprofit for a long time, and passion is like the currency. They're like, you care about this work. It's about the work. It's like, no, it's about feeding my family. So, and that, I think changing the narrative around, like, you must struggle to do good work.
Yeah.
And valuing the work that we do, and also getting funders to value the work that people do. And I think some funders who support nonprofit organizations or social workers, oh no, that's not what I also want to say. It's a structural, when we think about social work and the burnout, it's structural because there's so many other things at play. So you're getting hired to do one job, but now you're doing several because there's counseling, there's all of these other systems interacting, which makes your job much harder. So, I think I'm a fan of doing the work, but understanding that, if the policies and structures are broken, it's harder to do that good work. And so I think that, going upstream and sort of fixing what's creating the problem, because the issue is that with teachers, like, especially I am in relationship with a lot of teachers and social workers. It's like, yeah, I'm the art teacher, but I'm also the counselor. I'm also, I'm, all of these things.
Well, I think that you have given so much to think about and so many rich comments for us to reflect on and hopefully bring into our workplaces, even this one at UMBC. So I just want to thank you on behalf of our UMBC community, on behalf of the Center for Social Science Study, on behalf of the Gender and Women's Studies Department. I also want to thank all of our attendees, and our introducing folks and our sponsors. So this has been really wonderful. Deep amount of gratitude to you, Dr. Mason.
Thank you so much for having me. And this has been great. I love talking about this. It's been wonderful.
It's been wonderful for us. All right. Thank you, everybody.